And welcome to PM Express tonight. Have you heard a story of how Ghana is in desperate need of money to avoid the economy collapsing? Have you heard that? I've heard a story about a setting e-levy that will give us just about 7 billion cedis. Well, I have a story for you tonight that will show you that indeed Ghana is very, very rich. And this is according to the Fiscal Recklessness rankings and the report that was issued today by policy think tank Imani. And we're going to be having a conversation about what it reviews. So the cost of financial recklessness, the 13 billion CD question is what we're going to look at. So what did Imani establish in his report? They found in the Fiscal Recklessness Index and the report that was published today that between 2005 and 2020, if you put the irregularities that you find in the Auditor General's report together, you are talking about 13.9 billion cedis worth of irregularities alone. And this ranges from tax irregularities, tax that we are supposed to collect. We know those owing us, but we've just decided not to collect. Huge amounts of money involved. And then cash irregularities, some funds that are meant to go into government accounts, some of them are sitting in private accounts unaccounted for, etc., all coming together, and others indeed, paying ghost names, monies that you simply can account for. 13.9 billion in 5 years is what we are talking about. Some of them you can't simply account for. Some of them we just don't know where the money is. So it is a big deal for a country that is in the midst of an economic crisis to learn that we are having irregularities in a fiscal dispensation to that tune is jaw-dropping indeed. And now pay attention to this one too for me. That here, if you look at 2020, it is 3.64% of our GDP. That is big indeed. It could account for the entire sector of our economy. And we'll break it down for you what this means. So when we say 6.9 billion, what can it do? 3.64% of GDP. What is it? What is it comparable to? My guests will break down for me when we sit. And so we decided to take the report and help you visualize the problem, right? The last time Imani did this, they established, this was 2010, 2014, they established that the irregularities only amounted, I said only, is big, but in the context of what we are talking today, is only accounted for 1.42 billion cedis complete total irregularities between that period. Now look at the jump since the last time they did it to now. 871.4% jump. If your jaw is not dropping yet, then you're not appreciating what I'm talking about. 871.4% jump in irregularities. So the country is in dire need of money. We are taxing Ghanaians more, right? We want more, revenue, and yet we are possibly wasting 13.9 billion. And as the years go by, it's not getting better. It's getting worse, to the point where we are having 871% jump in the irregularities. That tells you, is this country a country that is worth even supporting when it comes to finances? Because we have a lot of this. And look, put this in the context of the SOE report and the billions that they were also losing. It tells you that what is really wrong with us, right? We'll break it down and ask that simple question of my guests. In fact, that's the first question I asked them on the subject in front of us. So what Imani did that I like was that they decided to rank the ministries, departments, and agencies in terms of which of them is the most fiscally reckless, financially reckless. And guess what? The finance ministry came up tops as the most financially reckless agency. But also pay attention to this. It's not, when we say finance ministry, it is not the ministry where Ken Oforiatta works necessarily. It is the agencies under the finance ministry, and that is very important. So the GRA, etc. And mainly, as you see on the screens there, we are talking about two main factors contributing to this. Tax irregularities, as you see here, are accounting for 99.63%. That is 9.10 billion. That's 9.1 billion cedis, tax irregularities. And then you also have cash irregularities, also giving you in excess of 2 billion. So that's combined. We're talking about a total of 11.45 billion, cedis in tax and cash irregularities. That is why the finance ministry and the agencies under it have been ranked Ghana's top most financially reckless, in terms of the rankings here. So that is pretty jaw-dropping indeed, and there's a reason why the finance ministry is. Now again, if you look at it, the key drivers of the MDA financial irregularities generally, again, you see the breakdown. Tax irregularities is 13, and you have the rest. This was due to the failure of the GRA to collect taxes due to the state and enforce compliance. And I make this point earlier. The GRA, if you read the report, they know the agencies that are owing us. And the Auditor General has made it easy for them to say, we know this agency owes us this month. We know that agency owes us this month. All we need to do is to go and get the money, and we don't. We sit and do nothing about it, and enforce it and get money for the states, but they don't. But as they say, they will choose e-levy because that one everybody has to pay. You can't really dodge because you have to send money to your loved ones when they need it. Again, some of the key drivers breaking in the cash irregularities, as we said. And what are these? Cash irregularities are largely driven by unapproved disbursement of funds. You have unapproved transfer of funds, delays in the lodgement of public funds that need to get into the appropriate account and simply go in there, and that is becoming an issue. And then you type of irregularities that we've also been identified: debt, loans, advances, contracts. Contracts is a big one. Contracts is a big deal. In there is corruption too. In there is corruption, right? So this also comes down to that too. Stores and procurement, payroll fraud is in there too, right? 14.6 million. It's quite a huge, significant amount of money. You can do a lot in this country. And if you track what Imani tells us here from 2018, for example, irregularities alone amounting to above 5 billion. That is really significant indeed. And then you look at the averagely, MMDA's fiscal and discipline costs about 2.3 billion annual between this particular period, if you're looking at the some of the key MMDAs. But I like this fact that we are separating the top 5 most fiscally reckless. Finance Ministry is number 1. Health Ministry is 2nd. Then you have the Roads and Highways Ministry coming in 3rd, and Employment Ministry and Foreign Affairs Ministry. So these are the top 5 most financially reckless ministries we have in this country. Now, the top 5 best performing, you see them. The best is the Chieftaincy Ministry here. I mean, government machinery, they didn't have the data for it in many of the years, so maybe that's what I count. So I'm going to discount that. We'll come to the question of why that is. But they go to Chieftaincy, Information Ministry, Water Resources, Transport. They seem to be doing okay when it comes to that. In comparison, in the land of the blind, the one eye man is keen, remember, because it's not like there are no irregularities there. It's just that the irregularities pale in comparison to Finance Ministry, for example, in 11 billions, right? So there's some irregularities there. It's just that it's smaller compared to the others. You want to get to a point where you have zero irregularity, right? Or those who engage in it are actually punished for it. And then recommendations. Imani says, apply the disallowance and surcharge powers given to it. Just do it. You have it. Dumelevu did it. I wonder what the current Auditor General is doing. Track areas, must align with the entire public financial management cycle. Institutions must ensure officers responsible are punished without delay. Work with the OSP to take legal action against perpetrators. My guests are joining me. We have the former Deputy Finance Minister, Kweku Kwarteng, my guest on the show, joining me via Zoom. Dr. Theo Champon is also joining me right now. Hello, Doc. Thank you for your time on PM Express. I'm grateful that you could join me. Mr. Kwarteng, thank you all for joining me also. Happy to have you in this conversation. Dennis Sasari is a lead consultant for Imani that did the work. He's also here with me. When I return from this break, I have to start with this fundamental bread and butter question. Having seen what we've just witnessed, 13 billion, considering that we are in a dire financial strait, really, what is wrong with us? It's a simple question, but it's a complex one. I'll ask that, and then we'll get into the specifics. Stay with me. And thanks for staying with me. My guest, as I indicated earlier, is a former Deputy Finance Minister, MP for Boase West, Chairman of the Finance Committee, Kweku Kwarteng, Theophilus Champon, Doctor. Theophilus Champon is economist and political science, political risk analyst, and also an Imani fellow. Dennis Asare is research consultant, Imani Center for Policy and Education. Dr. Champon, let me start with you actually on this. I mean, I read this from a very ordinary man's point of view, and I wonder, 13 billion due to financial irregularities at this time when we need it the most, with calls to go to the IMF, and you can't help, but the only question that keeps coming to my mind is, what really is wrong with us? Is that a fair question to ask?
Very interesting question, and good evening to Honorable Kweku Kwarteng as well, and my good colleague Dennis in the studio. I think it's a very fair question, and to put it into context, right? I was just looking at the 2022 budget in Appendix 4A, and I'm looking at the expenditure allocation to the Ministry of Food and Agriculture for 2022, and that actually just comes up to just a little under 798 million Ghana cedis. So if we're losing almost 14 billion Ghana cedis over the course of 6 years, then that tells you how much more that money could have gone to support a lot of the requirements that we need in the country. Again, you can look at the allocations to Ministry of Trade and Industry under one district, one factory for this fiscal year. 216 million Ghana cedi is the allocation. So if you take again that number, 14 billion divided by 216, it can basically tells you how many more of such interventionist programs we could do if we get our act right. And like I've always said, time on end, is that let it not be said that we don't are not raising enough revenues or resources in the country. We are, but sometimes we don't talk a lot about the expenditure side and some of the leakages that we see within the system. And that, I think, what this report does is really to put a lot of the current discussion in context with the fact that if we can address these irregularities, then perhaps some of the revenue measures that are being proposed may not be needed after all.
We'll drill down shortly, but let me bring in Mr. Kweku Kwarteng. Mr. Kwarteng, the numbers must surely break your heart, but I guess you would not be surprised because you've been there. And I need to ask that street question. Why have we failed to deal with this problem when we know it is there and it's costing us so much, in billions of cedis when we need it? Is it impossible? I have said, having read it today and knowing what we're coming from, that maybe we should just give up and just say, this is what it is. We can't do anything about it. We'll just lose the money every year. We'll survive somehow because we've survived for since independence. Is that view one that an ordinary person like me can take, having seen it? You have been there. Would you come to my conclusion that it's impossible to fix?
Well, I can understand why first I have to say good evening to viewers and if we have been listened to listeners as well. I think I can understand why you would put that question, that if for so long, and some of these irregularities have been associated with our public finances since independence. So there's a temptation to ask the question, can we ever fix this? But my answer to you is that unless we fix it, a time is going to come when it will become so difficult to do the ordinary things that we ought to do for ourselves as a people, that somehow some solution will be imposed on us one way or the other. We do not have a choice not to do anything about it. And I think generally it's it's a good report. It's good work that has been done. But if you give me half a minute, it may be important to explain aspects of the report that I think the organizers or the sponsors would have to take into account in the future. When you say the Ministry of Finance, there is that part of the ministry. It's actually two animals in one. And you can say the same for GRA. The Ministry of Finance as an MDA is just like any ministry. It has staff, it procures, it engages people to clean, and it does the usual things that every ministry will do. That is Ministry of Finance as an MDA. If you want to look at financial recklessness, as you call it, and compare it with other ministries, you will need to then look at that part of the ministry that has to do with their own activities as an MDA. But that to compare the Ministry of Finance's role as the center of government's treasury, where they are actually doing finances on behalf of other MDAs, then I'm not sure you are comparing the right things. And I am quite sure that given the way this was done, any day, for any country that you do it, the Ministry of Finance and its associated agencies, to the extent that they handle central government finances, would come up tops. So it probably is not very helpful to lean so much on the rankings. But that should not subtract from the fact that our public finances have traditionally suffered this, and we have seen it in Auditor General's report across the years. It has been fluctuating. I'm not too sure if we did the year-to-year analysis, you would have a consistent or even a trend. I sincerely believe, and I think we've done a bit of that studies in the past.
Yeah.
I sincerely believe that it just keeps fluctuating.
Yeah, I mean we do so well. We do so well in some years, and stay with me quickly because you made a very important one I need to come to. Dennis, he makes a very important point. We show the graph that you also put it in your work. We show that in some years, in fact, with the exception of 2018, which was worse, in 2015 or 2016, we really went very low in the irregularities, right? In fact, if you go back to the last time we did this, it was just $1 billion. Yes. So it is not impossible to do better. So why are we doing worse?
Well, good evening to your viewers and good evening to Honorable Kwarteng and Dr. Theo Champon. So I think that if you try to look at it from a single year perspective, you won't get a picture. So if you try to track back between 2010 and 2014, you see that the highest irregularity recorded was just about 500 million Ghana cedis. But if you now transition into 2015 and 2020, the average irregularity is about 4 times the highest recorded between 2010 and 2014. That tells us a picture that the situation is getting worse because the highest recorded within that 4-year period transitioned into a period where we've implemented a full-blown public financial management program. We've passed the PFM regulation. We've implemented a GIFMIS. There's a public procurement digitized platform and other measures being implemented. You are seeing that the highest irregularity recorded over the last 4 years. Now your average, even this latter period, is about 4 times of that. It tells you, it gives you a signal.
I guess the question I'm trying to drive at is, if you look at 2015, we were just above $1 billion.
Yeah.
So why didn't we maintain? Because that clearly it's a comparison, a very good performance.
Yes.
Yes, there was a billion plus amount of irregularity, but we did compare. So why can't we stay there? Why haven't we stayed there? Why is it the next year, then we go to above $1 billion? Then the next year after that, 2017, we come back to within $1 billion. So in some years, we're doing well. I guess the question is, if we can track back to see what we did differently in 2015 and 2017, that is what should be the gold standard, I guess. And then that sets, so why are we fluctuating? Why can't we stick to that stellar performance?
The reason why we are not able to maintain that performance is that let's remember that the irregularities are driven by 2 main things. the tax and cash irregularities. So a period where you record relatively lower volumes of tax and cash irregularities, you are likely to have a very low irregularity. So the periods that you are comparing with, if you check the tax irregularity of 2015, you see that it is relatively lower. And when you come to the period in 2016, it goes up because cash irregularities have increased. It means that the cash and tax management strategies have not been working effectively. And one of the key drivers of that is the weak enforcement of compliance. Another challenge that we've also observed over the period is that the internal audit system that is supposed to quality assure the process has broken down. At the moment, internal auditors do not have access to the GIFMIS. So they are only able to see transactions going through it, but they don't do quality assurance. And even when they are able to submit reports, their reports are not being implemented. So the main challenge that we face, or the reasons why we are not able to maintain a stellar performance, is that the tax and cash management strategies are not being consistently enforced. So anytime we lose our guard down on tax and cash irregularity management, we are likely to see a higher volume. So the 2018 figure tells us that within that period, we recorded, or the tax enforcement and compliance measures were not effective enough to ensure high compliance and address the leakages within the system. So the full measure, if you look at the PFM framework, it also tells us a story about how efficient the PFM framework is in delivering quality service or reducing some of these irregularities. So if we fail to address the main drivers, or we fail to identify the main drivers of these irregularities and apply tailored solutions to mitigating them, what we are going to see is that anytime we lose our guard down, we are going to see excess of that. That is why in periods where we're able to manage cash and tax well, you see that the irregularities...
So let me put that question to you. You made a point. So in periods when we control our tax and cash irregularity, we do well. And we've shown from the graph that there are periods we do well.
Yes.
But Dr. Tue Champon, if there are periods we do well, I'd love to hear Kuku Kwarteng's take, because he was there during some of the period. 2017, he was there. We did fantastic, right? But before he comes in, Dr. Tue Champon, if we are shown that in some years you're doing better with the tax and cash irregularities, why can't we just make that the norm?
Well, you have to go back to the political economy and how things work. Especially if you look at the data, 2017, new government comes in, they want to clean up the system, try to get things done. So normally what then you tend to see is that there's a bit more of an eagle eye, let me put it that way, in terms of the finances. Then in between, we lose our guard a little bit, and then subsequently you see those irregularities begin to creep up again in that regard. And for me, the thing really that was perhaps a bit interesting in all of this exercise is that when you isolate the 7 lines of irregularities that the Auditor General's report, because remember, this work is based on the AG's report and accumulating it over the 6 years, what is quite clear is that we need to have an eagle focus on the tax irregularities and an eagle focus on the cash. But the tax particularly, because we've been giving far too many of these, sometimes even exemptions away that are, the people are not qualified to be getting, largely because of the way sometimes the system, would tend to work. So you need to harmonize it, and that's why I think I would call on Parliament, Honorable, the committee, to as soon as possible pass the tax exemptions bill. That would really go a long way to sort of streamline a lot of some of these irregularities that we're seeing. That I think would be a very good starting point.
Kweku, what do you say to this?
Well, first, let me announce on behalf of Parliament that the tax exemptions bill before Parliament will be passed in the month of June. Our committee has already completed the meetings and engagement on that. We will lay it on the floor sometime next week, and within 2 weeks, I think we should be able to pass it into law. Now, I think, Dennis, it may also be helpful to look at these figures as percentage of GDP, and also perhaps as percentage of total government expenditure. then we will begin to decode the differences in the years. I just would move a little bit away from the figures and just say that there has been a traditional culture of breach of financial controls that would require, in my respectful view, bipartisan commitment to do radical reforms. And the suggestion in the report that the Auditor General should use the powers given under the Constitution to surcharge people, we must begin to crack the whip more. The fact that the tendency to breach the controls, one, sometimes because people are impatient, not that they want to steal, they just are impatient and find the financial controls too burdensome, are responsible partly for some of the irregularities that we are seeing. But also, there are in many cases circumvention of the rules and some of these breaches because people really want to steal from the public purse. Now, unless there is a new sense of urgency in fighting these irregularities, the culture will continue, and we may do year-on-year fluctuations and do. The fact of the matter is that these are figures. It depends on what the Auditor General is able to uncover. It might not necessarily mean much. What we do know, as a matter of fact, is that that culture is there, and people always want to take advantage of the system. So the digitization we are seeing, especially with DRE and by the Ministry of Finance, is very helpful. And maybe we should give them the support to be able to reduce the human interfaces in revenue mobilization, but also in the way we manage contracts and the procurement issues. The digitization will be very helpful. And then we should back the digitization, in my view, with also a bit of madman attitude. People must begin to feel that the state is now just mad, and if you are caught, you'll be dealt with very ruthlessly. And then people begin to be afraid. I invite not just the state as the government as the executive, but I also think the Auditor General should begin to use the powers at its disposal, because, you know, it's the executive that is doing the things. When I was in the ministry, if I realized that something was going wrong, say with DRE, the tendency is to call the DRE people and to say, look, you can't do this, let's correct it. That is your job as government. I think the Auditor General, and this will happen under any government, I think the Auditor General should be the man holding the whip, and to say now, even if it was out of negligence or it was unintended, a revolution sometimes can consume a few of its own children. Let us punish people. Let the Auditor General begin to surcharge. And hopefully let the public institutions, the police and the courts, come to understand that revenue, for instance, is half the economy. And it is the only way we're going to get this country to prosper. And therefore, the state entities, the police, the courts should all come together with some common resolve that going forward, the revenue and the finance issues, we will treat them differently. Hopefully, that sense of urgency would change the culture, and then we can hope that as we move on, we would see improvement. Otherwise, there will be yearly fluctuations. You would always look back and say, we are just where we are.
I mean, Dr. Champon, Mr. Kwarteng just announced that the bill on the exemptions will be passed in June. How much of a difference would that bill make to this problem?
I think it will go quite a long way, because what the bill seeks to do, when I last read it, which was about a year ago, that was the version I looked at, was to streamline the process of the grant of some of these exemptions. Hitherto, different ministries, department, agencies, everybody was doing what they wanted. And sometimes it would come to finance, and then finance would say, no, you cannot do this or do that. But the commitments would have already been made anyway. And if you look at some of the numbers, I mean, by some estimates, we're losing as much as 2% of the country's GDP to, these exemptions, which hitherto should not be given. And if you look at the report itself, if you just take the tax irregularities and you work out as a cumulative of GDP of 2020 GDP, that's just about 2.38%. So roughly within sort of that ballpark figure or range. So I think it will go a long way in streamlining the process. We know who gets what, and we're not just going to be giving exemptions, willy-nilly as we've been doing in the past for projects that sometimes don't actually bring any direct, benefit to the people, but because people have political connections, you name it, they're still able to get these exemptions anyway. So that, I think, is really fundamental and crucial. And the second point that both Dennis and Honorable Kwarteng have made, really about compliance and enforcement, is also absolutely fundamental in the sense that we need to see the whip being cracked, and we need to see people being surcharged for causing financial loss to the state. Because these monies can build several schools, they can build several hospitals, they can build several roads that really would improve on the lifestyle and the well-being of the people. But I get worried that over the years, the quantum of those irregularities actually is increasing, on a year, or whenever you do out like the averages. That must be a cause for concern.
Yeah, I mean, beyond the exemptions, I see in your report that part of the biggest problem also is that the GRA isn't collecting. And so, Dennis, let me bring you in here. You identified that in the Auditor General's report, some of the agencies or some private institutions owe us. We know it. It's in the report. But the GRA, for some reason, is not going for the money. I can't wrap my head around. What's happening there?
So I think that's builds up from what Dr. Theo mentioned about compliance enforcement. So, for example, in 2018, where 10 OMCs lifted oil from Tema Oil Refinery, and the tax liability of over 33 million was not collected. There are instances where vehicles are auctioned and about 25 million cedis of the taxes due the state are uncollected. And it's a kind of a problem with our revenue mobilization system. And if you read the public expenditure financial assessment, it's consistently highlighted that the major problem of our PFM is revenue mobilization. That is the extent of enforcing compliance. So it's not as if we don't know these people. For example, if you take the medium tax payment officers and the small tax payment officers, there are numerous VAT payees who have filed their VAT but owe the state, but the GRA is not collecting them. And when there is that delay, it affects the state's ability to implement its program. So we know the people. But as to compliance, that is where the challenge is. And even if there's a much higher problem in terms of enforcing penalties. If you read the Auditor General's report year on year, it is replete with examples of failure to apply the penalties. There was an instance where penalties of about 1.1 billion was not collected.
1.1 billion cedis
was not collected. And there were instances of even talking about the tax exemption, tax liability of two companies in the free zones of almost 10 million cedis, and they were given exemption of about 5 million without Parliament's approval. So it's about enforcement and ensuring that penalties are applied. And that is where I agree with Honorable Kwarteng that let us build a system where the penalties are applied and the enforcement is there and sanctions are also enforced. So there's a difference between even giving the sanction and making sure that that sanction is even enforced. So Parliament make recommendations, but who is following through to ensure that these sanctions are applied? So the whole challenge that we face, as Dr. Theo mentioned, is that within the tax system, it's just basically a challenge of enforcement. And let's acknowledge that the GRA is trying a lot of innovative ways. But I think we have to now critically delve into how do we ensure enforcement of compliance, particularly with the few that we know. before we get to the larger population where compliance culture is very
I mean,
poor.
so that for me is a key thing, right? So the government has made the case when they were trying to get the e-levy passed, and make the case that the informal sector, most of us aren't paying. But if there are billions and billions sitting with private firms, lifting crude that aren't paying, that questions that whole basis. I mean, because how much billions will you get? The e-levy is going to give us, what, 7 billion maximum? But there's 1 billion you just mentioned.
And even it's even the stress.
It's sitting there. We haven't gone to collect.
The total irregularity between 2015 and 2020, you will be surprised that it is equivalent to the expenditure of the Ministry of Education in 2021. And
that is uncollected tax?
And this is the full irregularities between 2015 and 2020. It's equivalent to the total expenditure of the Ministry of Education. So,
and that education ministry is possibly the biggest, it consumes a lot of our...
You see, there are a lot of leakages within the system that we know. So that is where the challenge is. The leakage that we know, how well are we sealing those leakages? And I think ITAD did an assessment. And if you look at the assessment on tax performance and revenue mobilization, Ghana performed very poorly in that area. So the challenge appears to be a legacy issue that Parliament and all other critical stakeholders must now start looking at. How do we enforce compliance with the little we know? Imagine this 13.9 billion coming into the government coffers before we get into the larger population where compliance is even extremely difficult because of the way our economy is largely informal. But if you come to even the formal sector where we know these companies, where about 3,600 companies owe the government in terms of corporate and income taxes of almost 836 million Ghana cedis. We can't say we won't be able to collect them. We know the companies, and we should find a very innovative way to ensure that they comply. And I think on Newsnight, you mentioned that now the GRA has been given the power to even prosecute. These are some of the higher compliance enforcement measures that helps this institution to depart away from the political economy influences. So now they have the power to now go after the people who owe us, apply the penalties, and ensure that the sanctions are followed through and we collect these monies. If we don't look at the enforcement side, we wouldn't
Yes, Kweku.
Evans, if I can just make this point, I've worked very closely with GRA. And of course, GRA has some challenges, but I think GRA puts in a lot more effort than it's obvious. For instance, the free zones companies that you say would be owing, maybe they will have been uncovered by some audit. Now, you go to them to collect the monies, and they go to court. And they use all the technicalities, the same way we see in other aspects of a national life. There will be litigation, there will be appeals, and you have public servants following these matters. You have the police, the security people, the judiciary, and at each point, there's a risk that people could get compromised, with a result that in spite of all the effort you would have made, after a year or two, you still have not been able to collect the money. Not that you not be making the effort. There appears to be weaknesses in the entire public sector that would make it difficult for GRA to deliver on that. I would say that there ought to be some kind of revolution where the police, I am not a lawyer, but maybe the Chief Justice, together with the police, the Auditor General, we must all come to some understanding that the way the world is going, we are going to have to mobilize our own revenues domestically. And to do that, the traditional postponement of cases and frustration of lawyers and won't work for us. And therefore, maybe we just some kind of tribunal where there is just a no-nonsense attitude to people who sometimes foreign investors who come here try to compromise public servants. And of course, not just foreigners, but it's disheartening to see investors do this. And GRA is just one entity in the entire public sector. So I'm just making the point that the media, everybody, there ought to really be a revolution where you have all these entities coming around to the realization that the traditional way of fighting these wrongs and crimes, especially in revenue mobilization and some of the things we see in expenditure, that those traditional methods are not working, and there ought to be perhaps a crazier way of fighting interests that are entrenched and are very strong.
I mean, and Dr. Champon, today it was announced by the GRA that they have now received the authority of the Attorney General to prosecute their own cases. So they don't have to go through the Attorney General anymore. So if they discover that you haven't paid your tax, the GRA, using their own, lawyers, will go to court and prosecute you. That will certainly make a difference, right? Because I see the problem there when they had to rely on the AG. The AG is overburdened with a lot of cases, and there's always a backlog, and you have to wait, for years, as Kweku Kwarteng has indicated. This announcement will make a big difference.
It will make some difference because you need some other elements to go with it, which is that the whole judicial system has to be fast-tracked when it comes to dealing with issues of financial impropriety. So in the original PFM systems of this country, at some point we're actually meant to have a financial intelligence court or something along those lines. It never really kind of got the full traction that is required. Currently, I know at the High Court, we do have something in relation to some section of the court that deals with issues of financial impropriety along those lines. But I think really giving the GRA the power, yes, is a good step. But if they go to court and they still get bogged down by the same age-old systems, processes, then it's very, very easy, as Kweku is saying, for somebody to be compromised, right, in that process. So what I think really is important now, and what will be complementary to the power that has been given the GRA now, is perhaps to think of having some sort of a tribunal or some dedicated section of the court, the ones that we have, strengthen them, improve them, and allow them to trial some of these cases a bit more, judiciously and much faster. Then we can begin to see some of them begin to bear fruit. But giving the GRA the power without fixing the challenges within the judicial system, I don't think really would really sort of yield as much fruit as we anticipate.
And just to make an announcement, I'm also reading now from my colleague who went to the GRA event today that they actually announced today that as part of the measures, there was also announced the establishment of a tax court, and understand that it's recently been activated, where the GRA prosecutors can go and have this fast-tracked. I guess that is part of the architecture, Doc, that you were saying should also be in place to address this. You wanted to say something?
Yeah, Evans, I think one thing I wanted to add to what Honorable and Dr. Theo has said is that beyond all of these measures, what we also need to critically look at is that it has become imperative for us to now look at how we can get the GRA away from the political system, because if you look at the whole GRA structure, the board and its leadership, the appointment is from the executive. So even when we set up these measures and the people who are found foul against the law are politically exposed persons, to what extent would the GRA have the commitment to prosecute people who are really key in government? So when until we make the GRA very independent, then we'll get to a point where
you're opening a Pandora's box.
Evans, you get to a point where we'll only prosecute people who are vulnerable, who may not know anybody, and we'll get to a time where the ordinary person in the street owing a few coins in the market are the ones the GRA prosecutors will follow. But the big fishes who are owing millions of cedis, they will get their way around because they are politically connected. So while we are doing all of this, let's look at how we can also strengthen the GRA and become more independent institutions so that when they are working, there's that little political interference or influence in there, because at the moment we see a lot of that political interference in the work that they do. Go to the port, and you see instances where we've identified people actually engaging
politically
in
exposed
illicit
persons,
activities, but these are politically exposed persons and you can't even sanction them. So if they are unable to do that, even when they have the power, even now, how much more when you create a court, how do they even pull these people to the court? So their independence will become very, very critical to when we, even when we give them the powers. We need to look at their
Mr. Kwarteng, what do you say to that? You were there, you worked very closely with them. Do they have the balls? Sorry, please unmute for me. Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, I don't deny the fact that, yes, sometimes officers within the GRA, they're a bit shy of going after people they consider are politically connected. But I sincerely believe that that is a small part of the problem. I say it's a small part of the problem because especially over the period that I was there, I saw clear commitment from the president, I saw clear commitment from the minister, but it probably would take time for public servants to trust that even when our superiors tell us that go after anybody, that if you go, you would not suffer. I think sometimes this particular point is overstated. What is probably more true is that there are elements within our revenue mobilization administration who themselves would make deals with taxpayers and would not do the right thing. And sometimes when they are telling their subordinates that somebody at the top has asked us not to do the right thing, it is really not anybody politician at the top. It may be that person's own irregularity. So it is just to make the point that for people outside, I know it's very easy to say the politicians may be getting in their way. But for those of us who have worked closely with GRA, you won't deny that there would be a bit of that. But I don't think it's the biggest problem. The real thing is the GRA revenue officers going out and not making deals with taxpayers. That is a much, much bigger problem, because if there's a system in which people believe that everybody is trying to enrich themselves, from pastors dipping their hands into church coffers and judges collecting goats and all that, and me too, this is my office. So I go to the taxpayer, I say your liability is 100 cedis, but if you would pay 50 cedis, we can share the 50. That is a much bigger problem that we have to deal with as a country than making it look like somehow people are happy to go out and do their work fully, but they're being restrained by some political interest. That is a much smaller problem.
Yeah, I mean, and Dr. Theo Champon, what's your comment on that?
No, it's interesting. I'm just listening, and the adage that says that everybody must chop for their work side, right? That's what often you hear when you go around. But I think yes, it's an issue, but the question really is what gives cause for an officer, a GRA, or indeed any other government agency to even think that, well, I can cut some deal on the side. Clearly, they would have also seen what some of their superiors, including the political appointees, are doing, right? So it's a systemic issue that must be addressed both from the stem and then the root as well as the head. Okay.
And then as we wrap up, we've talked a lot about the tax irregularities, and rightly so, because it formed the bulk of the irregularities, but the cash irregularities. You made some recommendations. Just what do we do to fix that? Because that's where you see the bulk of us playing, right? So the payment to ghost names
without vouchers,
without vouchers, forging the invoices, etc. What's the recommendation to do with that?
I think the key thing we need to address is let's strengthen the internal audit control within our MDs, because for the external audit person to see these irregularities, if the internal auditor is fully involved in the GIFMIS system as well as other cash management
in real time,
yes,
or post the expenditure,
in real time, at the moment they are doing the post work. But if you're able to strengthen them, give them access to the GIFMIS and give them some decision-making powers within the MDs, that helps them to be part of the cash management control system within the MDS, because all of these cash management issues, if there's an internal auditor, then there will be someone quality assuring the process to ensure that if a payment is going through, there's a voucher supporting it. If you are making an unapproved payment, someone is stopping it. But if you don't strengthen the internal audit control system within our public institutions, then it will be very hard for us to address these cash management
Dennis,
issues.
thank you very much. Dr. Tio Champa, I'm grateful. Kuku Kwarteng, thank you very much also. I'm happy to note that the bill is going to be passed in June to make a difference, and we'll hold you to that. I'm grateful that you joined us, all of you. Enjoy the rest of your evening.